Well, let me welcome you to another of our Northwestern Baptist Association online reflections, which is part of a weekly series that we're offering for those of you particularly who maybe can't get along to your regular church activities at the moment. But however you're watching it and wherever you're watching it, I hope you find some of these thoughts helpful. One of my favourite movie scenes is the one in the Disney cartoon version of Jungle Book, when the four vultures are sitting on the branch of a tree trying to work out what to do. Now, I'm not sure whether it's their over-the-top Scouse accents and this kind of takeoff of the Beatles that makes me like it, or maybe it's just the fact that I love the movie because it was the first one that I was ever taken to see in a cinema when I was a child. But if I'm honest, I think these days the reason that I like that scene is because, dare I say, it reminds me of some of the meetings that I've been in over the years when people just seem to be talking and talking and talking about when and how and why to do absolutely nothing. Anyway, if you want to watch it, just Google Jungle Book vulture scene and you're bound to come across it. But it kind of reminds me that we're not always very good as people at waiting. And although I must admit, since the introduction of socially distanced queuing, we've probably got a little bit better at it, we're still not that good at waiting. And that celebrated phrase, the devil finds work for idle hands, kind of reminds us that not only are we not very good at waiting, but we can very often get ourselves into serious trouble while we're doing it. And when we read the narratives of the Bible, it seems to me that this is no new phenomena, but has been part and parcel of human nature for millennia. And I say that in the light of one particular episode that we read about when, to be frank, the people of God simply got fed up waiting. And because they got fed up waiting, they ended up finding work for their idle hands and then got themselves into a whole load of difficulty. And I think that story might have particular relevance because we, of course, have had something of a period of waiting imposed upon us in recent days. Okay, lockdown may be lifting, but it's by no means over. And we are either having to do things in a very different way, or for many things are just still having to wait. And of course, for those of us who are a people of faith, one of the things that we are waiting for is to know when we can reopen our church buildings for worship, or at least open them for worship in a way that resembles something of what we used to be used to. And I've got to be honest, though, that I'm not sure that our immediate question needs to be when or how can we open, but why? Because the story that I want to share with you not only has something to say about waiting, but it also highlights the danger of undertaking religious activities for the wrong reasons. The story is set in the middle of the desert. God's people are making that epic journey from the land of bondage and slavery to the land of promise, and they set up their camp around Mount Sinai. And then Moses leaves the people camped in the shadow of the mountain because he's summoned by God, who begins to outline to Moses the vision for the life of this new nation that they are being formed into. Now, all of this begins way back in chapter 19 of the book of Exodus, but we're not going to pick up the story until chapter 32, and virtually everything in between is simply an account of God's instructions outlining the vision for this new holy nation that they are about to become. So we could perhaps begin this story in a different context by saying, meanwhile, back at the ranch, the people were getting fed up waiting. So let's pick the story up in Exodus chapter 32 and verse 1. When the people saw that Moses was so long coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him." Aaron answered them, "Take off the gold earrings from your wives and your sons and your daughters are wearing and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. And he took them and handed them and made them into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. And then they said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." And when Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord." So the next day the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Then afterwards they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. The term golden calf is still one that is used today to describe some unnecessary corporate enterprise that absorbs everyone's efforts and resources but turns out to be at best a complete distraction and at worst something that leads an organisation astray. And of course it's easy for us to read a story like this from the safe distance of thousands of years of history and convince ourselves that we would never become involved in such an unholy endeavour. But as that famous idiom, "the devil finds work for idle hands," reminds us, human nature has not particularly changed over all those years. And if we are impatiently waiting for the course of events to turn, then perhaps this story of a faith community impatiently complaining because they haven't seen their leader or had any religious activities arranged for them for a while has more to say to us than we might want to acknowledge at the moment. So I sense it would do us no harm to reflect on some of the dynamics that were at work in this rather unhappy episode. And trust me, if you carry on reading, things do not turn out particularly well. And the first thing that I want to suggest is that while we might want to condemn the actions of the various players in this story, they are entirely understandable. And it always strikes me that if I am serious about being a faithful follower of Jesus and I come across a situation where God's people behave in ways that I recognise to be wrong but nonetheless find understandable, then these are the things I really need to take notice of, because if I can understand why people behave that way, it probably means that I'm susceptible to behaving that way too. So let's begin by acknowledging the situation. These people had been through a period of significant upheaval. They'd left their homeland, which, was a place of slavery and oppression, but it was also the place of familiarity and routine. And they had pretty much put their collective faith in God and a man called Moses as the representative of that God. Moses, who, ethnically was one of them, but he hadn't grown up with them, he hadn't suffered the same struggles that they'd suffered, and he'd only really turned up on the scene a matter of months earlier. And everyone has now placed their trust in him, and he's disappeared. And if you look back to the early chapters of Exodus, one of the key arguments that was placed before Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, in releasing them so that they could go and worship God. So there they were. They were waiting. They were ready. And Moses didn't seem to be delivering. And so they go to see Moses' brother Aaron. Now again, it's easy to be critical of Aaron too, but he's faced with something of a dilemma. His brother has disappeared and he's left him in charge, and the community is in serious danger of disintegrating. And Aaron would certainly not want Moses coming down the mountain to find an empty camp and no doubt the desert floor littered with the dehydrated bodies of a people who'd gone off in 100 different directions under their own steam. So he tries to hold the people together by sort of giving in a bit and giving them something to do. And then the narrative becomes quite difficult to navigate. It's the people who do the collecting, but it's Aaron who does the making of the golden calf. And it's the people who declare this to represent the gods that have brought them out of Egypt, although interestingly, initially they do acknowledge it's Moses' God that's brought them out of Egypt, but guess that's part and parcel of it. And then maybe Aaron is trying to reclaim the situation, or even buy himself some time by announcing that the next day will be a festival not to these newly invented gods, but to the Lord. And he sets up an altar in front of the calf, which again causes me to wonder if he's sort of trying to stay true to God by positioning the altar alongside the calf so that the people will kind of really be worshipping God, but they'll also have their little distraction to keep them amused. I don't know. And I'm not trying to justify or condone Aaron's actions, but I am recognizing that they are understandable. And perhaps one of the reasons that I find myself somewhat sympathetic to Aaron's plight is because for the last 20 years or so, I've had the privilege of supporting local church leaders, and I know how tough it can be when God's people begin to pressure you with their expectations and their dissatisfactions. And it can often be a difficult line to tread between holding a community together and following what you believe in your own heart to be right. So whether or not this was true in Aaron's case, it is most definitely something that happens amongst God's people today. So yes, we have one leader at the top of the mountain seeking God and listening to God, and a leader at the bottom of the mountain trying to meet the expectations of the people of God and allowing God's people to get themselves into something of a mess. Because what begins as a religious activity simply ends up as one mass hedonistic expression of self-indulgence. Or as it says in verse 6, they sat down to eat and drink and got up to revelry. And I think we can work out what the writer means by that. But if you think about it, that wasn't because the atmosphere suddenly changed. This was always an act of self-indulgence. It may have begun in religious ceremony, moved on to the refreshments afterwards, and then descended into hedonism. But this was an act of self-indulgence from start to finish, which is why I would argue that whenever we are talking about our own religious activities, it's more important to ask why than when or how. Because it seems to me that these people of God were faced with a question. Are you looking for a good time in the general vicinity of God, or to become a nation that lives and works in relationship with God? Or, to use today's terminology, are you seeking to be consumers or disciples? At the top of the mountain, Moses is in a conversation with God, and the irony is that much of what God has to say is how the creativity and desire for worship among the people is to be rightly channeled. But the people get fed up waiting, and so they craft their acts of worship to their own design. And of course, let's not lose sight of the fact that they invest heavily in this enterprise. That's our earrings, our bracelets, our bangles that have been crafted into that calf. And golden calves become golden calves when people have a stake in their survival. And let's remember too, that this particular golden calf did not come into being because all the people got together and decided they needed one. They just got fed up waiting. Everything else that happened came from that mixture of their impatience and Aaron's poor handling of the situation. And of course, Moses is initially oblivious to all of this. And as readers of Exodus, if we were making our way through it, we would be too, because we will have become engrossed in chapter after chapter of God's great plans and purposes for this people. And therefore another question that emerges from this is, how do we use the waiting time? There was so much for them to discover about this God who had led them out of their land of bondage. There was so much for them to learn about who they were and how God would use the gifts and talents and aspirations. Even as this calf was being knocked together by Aaron, God was speaking of how God's Spirit would reside in crafters like Bezalel and Aholiab, who would build a beautiful tabernacle of meeting. And then God spoke of the Sabbath, another experience of waiting, but waiting in order to more fully experience their liberation and their sense of belonging in God. But impatience took over, and waiting instead became a source of discontent, and discontent gave way to appeasement, and appeasement gave way to self-indulgence, and the religious ritual that followed could not have been further from God's intent for this special people. And here's the rather awkward thing. It took a plague before the people fully recognized the mistake of building that golden calf. Now, I'm not arguing, therefore, that God has sent this plague upon us, but we are certainly faced with the consequences of one. And a question that I think we all need to ask is, how are we going to use this period of waiting? So I want to invite you to use this story to help you consider just that. And as usual, I'd suggest that you find some time and space when you can spend time with this narrative. And if you can, try to bring someone else into the conversation, either by engaging with this together or perhaps by just getting in touch to share some thoughts together and pray in the light of it. And perhaps you can begin with that question that I've just asked. How am I using this period of waiting? We're human. We can and will become impatient. But if we allow ourselves to be overtaken by our impatience, this story warns us that that can have difficult consequences. So, is this to be a period of impatience or a period of learning? Am I content to let those that we have entrusted to lead us to seek God's purposes for us, or will they just be presented with our expectations and pressured to deliver? Am I seeking to have a good time in the general vicinity of God, or to learn how to live a life that is centered on God in whatever circumstances I find myself? And then the next question you might want to ask is, what am I attached to and why? The golden calf represented, as I've already said, a significant investment on the part of the people. But they'd invested in the wrong thing. And we will have our investments in the work of God's kingdom. That in itself is not wrong if they're truly the things of God. But have we released those investments as an act of genuine sacrifice? Am I attached to things for the right reasons? And are they the things that God wants me to be attached to? And then the next question you might want to consider is, what is it that's motivating me? It may feel harsh to describe the religious activities of God's people as an act of self-indulgence, but in this story, that's what they revealed themselves to be. Now, it's not my place to sit in judgment on the things that matter to you, and I'm not going to do that. But I'm inviting you to do that. Just to recognise the very understandable human dynamics that were at work in this story, and in your own reflection and in the presence of God, just spend some time exploring your own expectations and desires and the motivations that lie behind them. And then the final question I'd offer you is what does God want? Now, I realise that's a pretty broad question, but I don't think we can avoid it. God took the people into the desert for a reason. And it's interesting to notice how often they then looked back on what they'd had before. Sometimes allowing the influences of Egypt with their numerous gods to continue to define them, as they did here, or sometimes openly craving to go back to the way of life they had. And as we come to terms with our new world, perhaps we too need to let go of some of the past and not simply be asking, when can we get back to what we had? What does God require of us now? God was giving Moses a vision for life in a new land, not a way of reliving the rituals of the old one. So, golden calves are easy to spot when they're presented to us on the pages of Old Testament history books, but the challenge for us is to try and spot them in our own contemporary reality and not to become attached to them in the way that the people of Exodus were. And I hope that these thoughts might help us all in some way to achieve that. Thanks for listening.